Does anybody need a lesson sheet this morning? Anybody else need one? If you have your songbook, turn to number 10, please. Number 10. Last week we finished our study on what the book of Proverbs has to say about our finances, and so we're going to start looking at what the book of Proverbs has to say about the relationships that we have in this life. And so we're going to start off this morning talking about marriage. And, you know, interestingly enough, Solomon doesn't say a whole lot about marriage itself. He says a lot about what a husband should look for in a wife and what that wife should be. And he says some things about what husbands should be, and we'll talk a little bit about maybe why that is this morning. All right, so we'll sing number 10, and then I've asked if Andy will open us with a word of prayer. The law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. More to be desired are they than gold, yea, than much fine gold, sweeter also than honey and the honeycomb. The statutes of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes. More to be desired are they than gold, yea, than much fine gold, sweeter also than honey and the honeycomb. The fear of the Lord is clean, enduring forever. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. More to be desired are they than gold, yea, than much fine gold, sweeter also than honey and the honeycomb.
Holy Father, we humbly bow before you this morning. Father, we thank you so much for the time we have to assemble together as believers and study from your word and to draw strength and encouragement from one another. Lord, we pray that you'll help us to always have an open heart, a soft heart to your word, to always look for ways that we can improve our lives. We know that our faith comes from hearing your word, and we pray that you'll help us to strengthen our faith as we study and to look at our lives for ways that we can apply these principles that are given to us. Help us to always look for opportunities to lead others and be a light to the world, and know that our faith and your word and the truth are the way that we can be there. Thank you so much for Jesus and the blessings that we have as your children through him. We pray this in his name.
Amen. That the song that we just sang in the second or the first verse, it says, "The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple," and that really sums up the book of Proverbs. And we talked about earlier how the book of Proverbs are not absolute truth. The Proverbs that Solomon gives us are a guiding light to how we should live our life, because he tells us, like we talked about last time, that the borrower is slave to the lender, but then he also tells us if we are in debt, how we should handle that. And so guiding principles to guide our lives. And so we're going to look and see what King Solomon has to say about marriage, and then we will likely not get to question number 5, but if we do, we'll start that study as well. So the first question I want to ask is, on Facebook, when you sign up for Facebook, it asks what your relationship status is. And what was Solomon's relationship status? What was his marital status?
Married.
He was married, and it's complicated. That's what he was. Yes, Sylvia.
700 wives and 300 concubines.
Right. 1 Kings chapter 11 gives us insight of what Solomon's situation was here. 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 1 through 8. It says, "Now King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women, from the nations concerning which Yahweh had said to the sons of Israel, You shall not go along with them, nor shall they go along with you, for they will surely turn your heart away after their gods. Solomon clung to these in love. And he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned his heart away." If we go down to verse 5, "For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the detestable idol of the Ammonites. And Solomon did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, and did not follow Yahweh fully, as David his father had done. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable idol of Moab, the mountain of which is east of Jerusalem, and for Molech, the detestable idol of Ammon. Thus he also did for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods." So this is the wisest man who ever lived, the man who was humble enough when God asked him, "What do you want?" He said, "Give me wisdom." And so God blessed him with all these other things. But the wisest man in the world chose something that was not in accordance with God's will. He knew God's plan. He knew what God would want of him, and yet he still chose to have these foreign wives. God had allowed the children of Israel to have multiple wives, not because that's how it was supposed to be, but even then it was supposed to, if you were going to have multiple wives, they should have been of the children of Israel. And so not only did he go against God's plan in having more than one wife, he went against God's plan in where he got those wives. And just to paint the picture of how far this took Solomon, in verse 7, Molech, the detestable idol of Ammon, that's the idol that they would put babies in the hands of, and they would sacrifice children. Solomon, the wisest man on the earth, because of God gave him the wisdom, he had the wisdom, he chose not to use it. And you see a man who was at one time a follower of God has gone to the far extreme of facilitating the sacrificing of children to a god. And all because the women he chose to marry, the women he chose to take. And so who we choose as a mate, we might should have had the high schoolers down here this morning. Who we choose as a mate is most likely one of the most important things that we will decide in our lives, because we can choose someone who's going to help us get to heaven, or we can choose someone like Solomon did, who's going to make it much more difficult. And in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 14 through 20, that's where God commanded them to take, that's where God commanded, well, let's just turn there. Deuteronomy chapter 17, not only did he break laws that all Israelites were supposed to follow, but he also broke some laws that were specific to kings. Deuteronomy chapter 17, starting in verse 14. When you enter the land which Yahweh your God gives you, and you possess it and live in it, you will say, I will set a king over me like all the nations who are around me. You shall surely set a king over you, whom Yahweh your God chooses. One from among your brothers you shall set over yourselves. You may not put a foreigner over yourselves who is not your brother. Moreover, he shall not multiply horses for himself. He should not cause people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. Yahweh has said, you shall never return that way. And he shall not multiply wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away, nor shall he greatly increase silver and gold for himself. And so, God predicted what was going to happen. He said, if you multiply your wives, you will be led away. If you choose women who are not of the children of Israel, you will be led away. And so when we sum up Solomon's life and then we look at what he has to say about marriage, maybe I see that as, we see Paul's personality come out while he writes his gospel, because he's got these long sentences and he's a very detailed man. I think we have Solomon's life experiences and his personality coming out in this letter that he wrote, because Solomon should not be the example of how we manage our marriages. And anyways, I just thought that was interesting that when you read through the book, there's very little said about marriage that is in a good light. And we'll look at that in a verse. Any thoughts about that? Any other points on that?
I was just thinking that not all these were because he loved or fell in love.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of these were treaty agreements with other nations to keep peace. And so, people did that all through the kingdoms, that exist.
Right.
They make treaties with another nation and they take wives. So.
Exactly, yeah. Some of these were political marriages, right? They were made to keep the peace. But we see that would, if we look at the long-term path of Israel, we see that did not bring peace. That brought them into captivity because they strayed. And Solomon, being the king, set that example by his marriages of how the people would follow. All right, so we're going to look at a few verses that Proverbs does have to say about husbands and wives. And so the second question is, according to Solomon, how should we view our spouse and or marriage? So if someone will read Proverbs chapter 12, verse 4.
A virtuous woman is a crown to her husband. You want the whole thing?
Go ahead and read the whole thing.
But he that maketh ashamed is a rottenness in his bones.
All right, so you're right. The first part of this verse has to do with our marriage. The second part, maybe not so much. So mine says, an excellent wife is the crown of her husband. What imagery is he placing on the crown? If he's saying an excellent wife is the crown to her husband, what is he to her? What is that? How does that mean? What does that mean for their relationship?
He's got her on a pedestal.
Got her on a pedestal? What'd you say, Alma?
It's the head.
It's what's that?
Valuable.
Valuable. She is precious. A husband who finds a wife, an excellent wife, is precious. Now, I wonder how many of those 700 Solomon would quantify as that. I don't know, but I imagine he had some favorites, but it seems like all of them got what they wanted no matter what. And so we see here that Solomon is saying is the excellent wife to the husband should be the showpiece, should be the most valuable thing that he owns. It's the thing that shows how well he has done. The king would have had not just a little crown; he would have had this big crown that showed outward to the world who he was. And so, a husband, should treat his wife as such. And we'll ask this multiple times. I will ask this multiple times. Does this go one way, or is it both ways? It goes both ways. I think when we read even most of Proverbs 31, the Proverbs woman, most of those things go both ways. There are some things that are, I think, wife specific throughout most of this, but the same way, an excellent husband should be the crown of the wife. And so that mutual, if both of you are excellent to each other, and we'll talk about what happens the other way as well. But both husband and wife should see the other person as very valuable. And I think back to Solomon here. Who gave him the crown? God did, right? And we'll read here in a second that there's more parallel to that. Yes, Jen?
I was just going to add that she brings him honor. So it seems like a very specific, way to describe a relationship.
Yeah, that's a great point. The king, I'm sure they would have known who he was walking around the streets. But if he was walking around the streets with the crown on, they for sure would have known who he was, and that would have brought him honor. That's a great point, Jim. All right, continuing on, chapter 18, verse 22. If someone will read that.
Man's greatest treasure is his wife. She is a gift from the Lord.
There we go. Driving home that point, like we see the parallel between the crown and the wife. That who gives a man a good wife? Right? God has made that person. What is a good wife?
A helpmeet to the husband.
Helpmeet.
Instead of a person who's going to bring him honor and respect.
Right.
So many different things.
Someone who follows God, right? And so not only does God providence work in bringing people together, but also the fact that a woman has chosen to follow God, that makes her an excellent wife. And so in that way, God has also given that. And so we talked about how the Proverbs are not always absolute. Is everyone who find a wife, is that a good thing for everyone? Do some people make the wrong decision?
And
Right.
people make the wrong choices sometimes because they complain and say, well, you chose him or her. You make that choice.
Right.
Yes, I believe that you're a Christian, you pray to the Lord, and He provides you with a good wife or husband, but sometimes you're not a Christian and you make bad choices. And
Yeah.
you wind up with.
So he's not saying that everyone who marries is going to be happy. He's not saying that everyone who chooses a mate is going to choose right. But he's saying that if you are following God, and I think even more so, if both people are choosing to follow God, then it will be a good thing. Yes.
We have an example of Hosea. He was commanded by God to go find a wife of harlotry and raise children with the expectation that she was not a good wife. And it was to teach Israel the problem that God had with Israel their unfaithfulness. And so you can't just find any woman and that's going to be your wife. It's hunting for somebody who aligns with your moral, ethical, religious ideas. So that for you to be successful, you need to find a wife who's going to help you be successful.
That's a great point. Can you imagine God commanding you to take a harlot for a wife? You talk about a test. He's already talked about how hard it is to choose and how good a thing it is to choose a good wife. And then that's a great story and a test for Hosea. Yeah.
Well, that point was that he wouldn't believe those children were his. Right? That was the point that were foreigner kind of.
Which adds a whole nother level of it's complicated.
I mean, I have a cousin, Vietnam veteran. He married a girl that didn't speak any English. I wondered for a long time how that worked.
Yeah. If you Jason Williams and Hilda, when they first started dating, they didn't speak the same language. So yeah, it's interesting. All right. Any other thoughts on that verse before we move on?
Ecclesiastes 9 and verse 9 says, enjoy life with the wife you love all the days of your fleeting life. That's the Christian Standard uses fleeting. NIV says meaningless, which has been given to you under the sun for all your fleeting days. And so I'll refer to the purpose of a wife being a help that is suitable. And so in your life, that's a great advantage. If that's not true, it's a great disadvantage.
Right.
It's a battle. And so rather than getting help, you're getting problems.
Right.
And so
Yeah. Life and being holy and being righteous is hard enough when two people are together and in the same goals, and someplace where the home is a refuge away from the world. But when we find that, like Solomon here, you go home and you're still involved, you're still surrounded by the world, how much harder does that make life? And so, like you said, not having a Christian husband or wife does not mean that you can't be righteous, but it definitely makes it more difficult.
and so that it becomes a crown and something to be very thankful for.
Makes the unequally yoked ox, right? All right, the next chapter, chapter 19, verse 14. Chapter 19, verse 14 says, house and wealth are an inheritance from fathers, but a wife who has insight is Yahweh. Some versions say a wise wife is from God. And so the things of this life, and I also think this verse is interesting because most of the marriages at this time would have been semi-arranged. But he's saying that the house and wealth are an inheritance for the father. And sometimes in this culture that he's speaking about here, the wife would have been that also. But he's saying that a wise wife is from God. And so Proverbs chapter 14 verse 1 talks about what a wise woman does. It says the wise woman builds her house, but the woman of folly tears it down with her own hands. And so again, this goes both ways. That the wise man builds up his house, and the foolish man can tear it down from within. In the same chapter 19, verse 14, the wise wife is a gift to the husband, and the wise husband is a gift to the wife as well. And then chapter 31, which I intentionally did not choose verses from chapter 31 because it's its own study in and of itself, and maybe we'll do that soon. But one thing we have to remember about chapter 31 is that King Solomon did not write this. So this is the words of King Lemuel. These are the words of the mother of King Lemuel. So a mother is telling King Lemuel. We don't really have a good idea who King Lemuel is. His mother is telling him this advice about who to seek out as a spouse. And in verse 10 of chapter 31, it says, "An excellent wife who can find, for her worth is far above pearls." Going back, making the same point that he made when he talked about the crown. And that's a spouse that is righteous, a spouse that is wise, a spouse that is going to help us get to heaven is more valuable than all the pearls, right? It's more valuable than anything else that you can have. Again, because they're going to help you get to the ultimate goal, to the prize that is after this life. And so when we ask this question, according to Solomon, how should we view our spouse? How should we view our marriage? I think Solomon, even though he had 700 wives, 300 concubines, he still recognized that a good spouse is valuable. And a good spouse is something that we should seek out. And a good spouse is a gift from God that we should be thankful for, right? Any other thoughts about how those verses, how we should view our spouse or marriage? Yeah, Andy.
I just thought it was interesting that a lot of his proverbs almost say like a simple life, and he didn't say just have one wife, one good wife, but better. It's almost like he's speaking from the perspective of I've had, like this, I've had all these things, but if I had one good wife and a little house and simple things, it would have been better than all these complications and stuff. So it doesn't seem like he's speaking from experience on the good side, but maybe he's seen how it's supposed to work. And I think we see it in the world a lot of times that somebody that we can look at marriages and say, wow, that's the way I want mine to work. And I think he's probably done that same thing too.
Yeah, I think he can see his foolishness and see how it's actually supposed to work. And that's what amazes me, and something that I think teaches us that we have to be on guard. Because Solomon knew before he took those 700 wives and 300 concubines, he knew what was wise. Because God had given him that wisdom. And yet he still chose, he's like, I know this is right, but this is what I'm going to do. And so, interesting, if Solomon, the wisest man in the world, who has gifted wisdom by God, can make that decision, then my feeble self can definitely make that decision to do that. And so we need to be on guard for that. Yes, Alma?
I was just thinking that, we are all reading from different versions of the Bible, and so going back to 12:4, about the excellent wife is the crown of her husband, but the New King James says, but she who causes shame is like rottenness in his bones. So you're either a crown or you may be causing shame to your husband.
Yeah, that's a great point to go into our next question, because the first verse on the next question is Proverbs chapter 12, verse 4. And so I like to point these verses out, but we're gonna read them all. And again, the question I ask here is, does this go both ways? And the answer is absolutely. But Solomon's experience as a man riding with 700 wives and 300 concubines, he writes this from his perspective. So, question 3, Solomon has a lot to say about a quarrelsome marriage. I did not put a quarrelsome wife in that question for a reason. And I said, so we're going to ask why. We're going to ask, does it apply to both wives and husbands, which we've already answered, and what application should we take from this? And so Alma read the first verse, which was also a verse that we looked at with how valuable marriage is. He said, an excellent wife is the crown of her husband, but she who causes shame is like rottenness in his bones. That's not like a flesh wound, right? That's like deep-seated rottenness. And that's not something I think any one of us would want. But let's read the rest of these verses. Someone will read chapter 17, verse 1.
house full of feasting with strife.
All right. So if you get to choose your meal, do you want the dry morsel or do you want the feast? We would all likely choose the feast if that's all that came with it. But he's saying that it's better to have that dry morsel and my version says tranquility or peace than to have a lot, but your home be filled with strife. Chapter 19, verse 13.
A foolish son is the ruin of his father, and the contentions of a wife are a continual dripping.
They wouldn't have had faucets in this day, but imagine the dripping faucet that drips, and you can't unfocus on it, or you can't get your mind off of it, and it just drips constantly, and it's just there all the time, nagging and annoying you. That's the picture he's painting in this verse. Chapter 21, verse 9. This one.
Better to dwell in the corner of a housetop than with a brawling woman in a wide house.
That one's one of my favorites there. Better to live in the corner of the roof than in a house shared with a contentious woman. 25, verse 24. Chapter 25, verse 24 says, it's better to live in the corner of the roof than a house shared with a contentious woman. The same verse there. And then chapter 27, verses 15 and 16, I'll read that. A constant dripping on a day of steady rain and a contentious woman are alike. He who would restrain her restrains the wind and grasps oil with his right hand. So, first of all, we'll ask the question, does this go both ways? It absolutely does. It is no easier for a wife to live with a contentious man than it is for a husband to live with a contentious woman. And so, while it's funny to read these verses, but it's a true thing. We see this in the world today. We see husbands and wives that are constantly at each other's throats. Husbands and wives that can't even go out in public and treat each other with respect. And we know there are people that happens at home as well. You know, there's some things about being a Christian that I can't imagine the opposite way. You know, I can't imagine like having a death of someone very close to me and not being a Christian. I can't imagine the hope what is there if you're not a Christian, if you don't believe in God and believe that God has a plan for us. The same way with a quarrelsome husband and a quarrelsome wife. I can't imagine what it's like going home to a house that doesn't have peace, that doesn't have tranquility, because God has blessed me greatly with that. And so God's plan is for the home to be a place of peace, a place where two people have the same goal, and that is to eventually get to heaven. And their ultimate goal is to do that. And so two people that are working together to do that, not saying you're not going to have your disagreements, not saying you're not going to quarrel a little bit, but it's the picture that he's painting here is two people that are not on the same page, two people who could not be any farther away from each other and who are just at each other's throat all the time. As a Christian, I can't imagine a home being like that. But we have to realize that there are people in this world today that's what they're dealing with. And there's one answer for it, and that is God. There was a book when I was a teenager that talked about how to choose a husband or wife. And it was that you're running this race, this Christian race, and you're running it and you're looking around, and the people that are running with you are the people that you should be looking at for husbands and wives. Not the people who are not interested in the race, not the people who are in the stands, but the people who are running the race with you. And I thought that was a good picture of that. Jen?
So this is more of a side note, but I think, how he describes things, he's talking about like the specific roles of husbands and wives. So when he's talking about like the crown, the wife is the crown of the husband, it's like my understanding is it's more because the husband's the leader. He's like that. Grumpy, so it doesn't quite go the opposite way possibly, but also like when he's talking about the wife and the quarrelsome wife, he's pointing out a quality that's like more specific to women, and like they're more likely to be the naggers and the busybodies, that were pointed out in the New Testament. But I think he goes after men for like laziness and being sluggards, and I just think it's interesting. He seems to really pull out the most dangerous or tendencies of men or women.
Yeah, I think absolutely. There are things that men struggle with more than women. I appreciate that point of view, but I think it does lean more that way. But I have met some men that were quarrelsome. I mean, they just fight because they like to fight. I mean, I have people in my family that they just like to fight, and so I appreciate that point that he may say it this way because women may struggle with this more, but it can go both ways. Yeah, great point, Jen. Yes, Alma.
He might say it that way too because he had all these women. I'm sure they were all tugging in different directions, and it's so constant. He didn't please one, she'd be unhappy. He had so many women to please, so there's always somebody nagging at him. All the many women he had.
You imagine 700 husbands or 700 wives. There's always going to be a complaint, right? There is no reprieve from the quarrels, right?
He was also a judge. And if you've watched Divorce Court or anything on TV, same story.
Yeah.
At work and then when you get home.
Yeah. Absolutely. That's a great point. He would have heard it at work as well. Any other thoughts on these verses? And so I asked myself this question. Who is at fault of being a quarrelsome? If I'm saying this, my wife is not quarrelsome. She is the quite opposite of quarrelsome. And so if I have a wife that is quarrelsome, can I, as the husband, egg that on? Absolutely. And so, I almost pointed at David. I don't know. So it can go both ways. And so, I hope nobody here is in this situation, but if you find yourself in this situation, the answer is to both get on the same page and go towards God. And when both parties, husband and wife, choose that we're going to do what glorifies God, then that brings you closer together. But if you find yourself in this situation, this is not an easy situation. This is what the New Testament talks about, being unequally yoked. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't give us an out, right? He doesn't say if you have a quarrelsome wife, drop her on the side of the road and go do your own thing, right? He said you've made your bed. You've chosen to live this way. It is a test that you have chosen and put in your life. Yes, Kyle.
So back in the early 90s, we leased some land from Mr. Bruce. And Mr. Bruce was a mean man. You didn't even want to cross his path because it's so much negativity. But when you meet his wife, there's nobody better. She was gold. I mean, golden gold. Nice. It's like, how can they be in the same house? But she endured that day in, day out. And even whenever they went to the garden, he was complaining, and the whole time she had a happy smile on her face. She was happy in life, content. Now, she didn't do that all on her own. I'm sure she had some resources like God in her life that helped her, and family and things of that nature. But she remained committed to that marriage. And I don't know how committed he was, but life had been hard to him, and he wanted to be mad. But she wanted to be happy. And they both were at two ends of the spectrum, and yet they still were the same.
Yeah. And we can look at those situations. Maybe all of us have know a pair like that, a marriage like that. I have grandparents that way. My grandpa's nickname in town was Meanness. Everybody knew. But my grandmother was the sweetest lady, and I don't know how she put up with him, but she chose to. And we can look at that and say, we need to look at that and ask myself, am I the quarrelsome one? And if I am, how much is that? That's not showing my wife, my spouse, that I love them, and that's not putting them above our own needs. I had a set of great grandparents. I think it was on my mom's side. Those two people, my great grandmother and great grandfather, could not stand each other. They lived in the same house, and he had his bedroom, and she had her bedroom, and she cooked supper, and he paid the bills, but they did not like each other. And so we can look and see examples of how marriage is not supposed to work. And a lot of it has to do with these quarrelsome tendencies that some may have. And so when we look at those, I think it ought to convict us to look at our life and say, am I the quarrelsome one? Am I the one who is putting my gripes, my complaints above that of my spouse? And hopefully we don't find ourselves in this situation. But it's something that we need to make sure that we are checking on every now and then. When you have a gripe or complaint, maybe stop and think, am I just complaining to complain, or is this actually something that needs to be fixed? Because there are things in marriage that you have to work on. There are things in marriage that you may have to bring, we'll look at that in just a second, to your husband or wife that they're not going to like. And so you have to have those discussions. But if every day, every minute of every day, there's a complaint, we need to make sure that we're checking ourselves. Any thoughts on the... We don't have time to get to question 4, but we'll go ahead and read one verse because it ties in well there. Chapter 27, verse 6. So I looked through Proverbs. I'm sure there are others. These are a few tips that I think can apply to marriage, but I don't think they necessarily only apply to marriage. But chapter 27, verse 6 says, faithful are the words of a friend. Faithful are the wounds of a friend, but deceitful are the kisses of an enemy. And so we ought to all pray for a relationship in our marriage where our spouse can come to us and wound us, and it be okay. And we ought to pray, not wound us just for the sake of wounding us, but wounding us for the sake of helping us, right? We all have seen in our lives things that need to be corrected. And I hope that each one of us has or will choose a spouse that when they see that we need to get back on track, that they will come to us and that they will have that hard discussion with us. But we'll finish question 3 or question 4, and then we'll take a deeper dive into question 5. Solomon has a lot to say. Solomon doesn't have a whole lot to say good about marriage. He's got a few things that we looked at this morning. Solomon has a lot to say about adultery. And so we'll look at those, and I'll blush when I read some of the verses, but it's what Solomon has warned us. Solomon has given us a great warning against probably the thing that led him away from God.
I mean, the world we live in, it's hard to blush at anything.
Yeah.
Because you can't hide from it.
That's right. Absolutely. Any other thoughts about these, at least the first 3 questions that we looked at this morning? All right. I appreciate your comments and participation in class.